Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of the American Political Tradition. Hope you guys are doing well. I posted the participation grades for the first 5 weeks on Canvas, so you should be able to go into each week and see, see how you did. Remember, it's from 0 to 10. I gave you a 10 if you posted everything on time and responded thoughtfully to a classmate. If you just responded to my question, I gave you an 8 if you did that on time. If you didn't do it on time, I gave you slightly less points, and just some variations in there depending upon when you posted, what kind of post you did, etc. So, and I wanted to remind people who have not been participating in the discussions that it's a significant part of your grade, and it's actually the most important part of the course, in my opinion. That's how we learn, is by participating in these discussions with one another. So I encourage you to do that because it will, it's a significant part of your grade. So taking the quizzes, doing the midterm is not enough. Also, the information that's on the midterm and the quizzes is going to be drawn from some of our discussions. So it's important that you're participating in those and paying attention. Okay, so enough on that. If you guys have any questions about discussion grades or whatever, feel free to shoot me an email. I was going to split you up into another discussion group this week, but I think it may be a little too soon. So I'm going to keep the discussion groups the way they are now. I may change them up around the midterm, something like that. Okay, so this past week I had you guys look at Jefferson's first inaugural address and his sort of opinion on the constitutionality of the First National Bank. And this marks another important transitionary period in American politics, where the Revolution ends, the Articles of Confederation are too weak. So the Federalists sort of get together and form the Constitution, which leads to sort of, even though they weren't necessarily a party, sort of the Federalist concentration of power, right? Which Washington kind of fit into that category, and Adams certainly did. Adams was the first and only officially Federalist president. So yeah, they had been in power for a while, right? And a lot of that goes back to Hamilton. Hamilton, the guy who drafted a lot of the Federalist Papers, the majority of the Federalist Papers actually, was sort of the driving force for federalism, right? And remember, when we're talking about federalism here in the context of the Federalist Papers, we're talking about a strong centralized government and the importance of a strong centralized government with the authority to take decisive action. So that's sort of the Federalist, the overarching principle of the Federalist philosophy regarding government, right? But remember, we also had sort of the anti-Federalists as well, writing at the same time as the Federalist Papers came out, sort of saying, you're giving too much power to the central government and not enough power to the states, and the states' rights are essentially going to be trampled, which eventually led to the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. So Adams is president, right, and Hamilton is sort of running the show, centralizing power, and his main strategy for doing this is this creation of a national bank, right? Because he's trying to gain credit. So they can actually borrow money from foreign governments. So, this national debt thing that we have now that's out of control. You can thank Hamilton for that, right? He's the one that sort of got us kick-started on that path, right? But he thought that the more debt that the national government had, the more credit they would get from foreign governments, because the idea is if you owe money to somebody and you're paying that off on a regular basis, then you're more likely to pay off your other debts. So Hamilton's plan was to, after the Revolutionary War, the states themselves were paying for the costs of the Revolutionary War, the costs of government, things like that. Hamilton's proposal was that the national government create a national bank and assume the debts of the states. And under Adams, this is what happened, right? But Jefferson was very concerned with this, right? Because in Washington's cabinet, Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury, first Secretary of Treasury, and Jefferson was the Secretary of State. And Jefferson spent a lot of time overseas during this period. He was in France for a while, and he came back, and they were discussing there's a great scene in the John Adams documentary, or not documentary, the HBO miniseries. If you guys Google it, it's Jefferson versus Hamilton, where they have this great discussion about the consequences of creating a national bank. And Jefferson, he's philosophical as always. He's coming back from France, and he's talking about how he saw the flowering of liberty and all these great principles and individual rights being, touted. And he comes back, and Hamilton and everybody else is talking about, fiscal policy and money and administration, and not necessarily the high-minded ideals that Jefferson is interested in. So he says, I'm disappointed to hear all this talk of, money, right? So Hamilton explains his plan to Jefferson for creating a national bank, and Jefferson says, wait a minute, all the moneyed interests in the colonies, at least where the majority of the money actually lies, was in the merchants or mercantilism that was sort of located in the northern states, right? So Hamilton was from New York, right? So that's where a majority of it was. But Jefferson, and the majority of people in the South were farmers. So a lot of their capital was actually in land. It wasn't in sort of, money, right? They didn't have money in banks necessarily. Most of their stuff, most of their property was farms or, slaves, right? So Jefferson realized that if, this sort of banking system got set up, that would mean that the Southerners would be beholden to the Northerners, right? So here we start to see right away sort of this growing division that led to the Civil War between the North and the South. So Jefferson was very opposed to it for that reason, and he talked about other reasons in the paper that we read, where he said that it was unconstitutional, right? And this is the sort of strict interpretation. You guys have heard this, I'm sure, in your earlier political science class. There's a strict interpretation of the Constitution and a loose interpretation, and Jefferson is often viewed as a strict. He favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution with the 10th Amendment, when it talks about the separation of national rights and state rights, which says that any right that's not expressly given to the national government falls to the states. And Jefferson's argument was that there is no place in the Constitution where it provides for a national bank. He said that the argument is that it would make things more convenient, but it's certainly not mandated or provided for in the Constitution. So for that reason, Jefferson opposed it, but he also opposed it for these philosophical reasons of North and South. And, one of the major principles of Jeffersonian republicanism, which was kind of what we were talking about this week, was sort of this agrarian, utopian democratic society, right? Jefferson had this idea that every certain amount of land in each state should be divided up into wards, is what he called them. And that was essentially where he thought that, democratic principles could actually flourish, was in sort of these very small geographic areas, very small farming communities, right? Because he was obviously a farmer himself, or, owned a farm. So he thought that that's sort of where democracy should flourish, and in the way that it should flourish in the United States. So he was very opposed to this Hamiltonian idea of trade and mercantilism and things like that. So that's, both philosophically and legally, that's why Jefferson opposed this first bank. So republicanism, it's an old idea, right? Republicanism goes all the way back to, I would say it goes back to Aristotle, right? And the politics Aristotle is talking about, he explores three different types of government. Right? He explores democracy, where the power is with the people. He explores monarchy, where power is given to one individual, and he explores aristocracy, where it's sort of like the few, right? The few who deserve to govern actually govern. Government by the best among us, you could say, I guess. But Aristotle concluded that the best form of government, or at least people following Aristotle have, so Aristotelians have concluded that the best form of government is a mixed government. Right? That's the best way that we can make sure society,